I never thought a cardiologist's office would be the place where my entire life unraveled. But when Dr. Anita Phelps looked up from my wife's stress test results that gray Thursday morning in February, something shifted behind her eyes, something careful and controlled. And 20 minutes later, I was sitting alone in a consultation room, being asked questions I never imagined anyone would need to ask me about the woman I had been sleeping next to for 6 years. My name is Thomas Birch. I am 64 years old, retired from 31 years as a high school history teacher in Asheville, North Carolina, and until that morning, I believed I was one of the luckier men in the world. My first wife, Carol, died of ovarian cancer 4 years before I met anyone new. We'd had 38 years together, long enough to finish each other's sentences, short enough that her absence still surprised me sometimes. I'd find myself turning to say something to her in the evenings, and the empty chair would knock the breath right out of me. The grief counselor I saw for about 8 months after she passed told me that was normal. She said grief doesn't move in a straight line. She was right about that. I wasn't looking for anyone when I met my second wife. I wasn't not looking either. I was just trying to get through my weeks. My son Andrew, who lives in Knoxville with his wife and their 2 kids, had been gently nudging me toward trying one of the online dating apps. He'd sat across from me at Thanksgiving 3 years after his mother died and said, "Dad, she wouldn't want this for you. The quiet, the empty house. She wouldn't want that." I told him I appreciated the thought and changed the subject, and he let me, because Andrew was always known when to push and when to step back. The woman who would become my wife walked into my life at a completely ordinary moment, a fundraising dinner for the local literacy foundation, held at the old Omni Grove Park Inn. I was there because a former colleague had dragged me out of the house. Her name was Faye Alderton, and she was 53, recently relocated from Columbus, Ohio, after what she described as an amicable divorce from a man who simply stopped growing. Those were her words. He simply stopped growing, and I needed room. She was sharp and funny and warm in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. She asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. She had dark eyes that caught the light when she laughed, and she laughed at my terrible puns about historical figures, which I consider a form of loyalty. We talked for nearly 3 hours that night, and when her friend came to collect her, she turned back and handed me a card, just a plain white card with her name and number. No explanation, no pressure, just the possibility of something. I called her 4 days later. We had dinner, then another dinner, then a weekend drive up the Blue Ridge Parkway that lasted longer than either of us planned because neither of us wanted it to end. Andrew met her about 5 months into things. He flew down from Knoxville for a long weekend. He was polite, attentive, asked her thoughtful questions about her work as a freelance interior designer, about her life in Columbus, about the divorce. She answered everything smoothly. On his last morning, over coffee while Faye was still asleep, he looked at me carefully and said, "She seems good for you, Dad. Just take your time, okay?" I remember thinking he was being protective, the way children are when a parent starts over late in life. I appreciated it. I didn't read it the way I should have. We were married 18 months after that fundraiser dinner. I know it was fast. But I was 61 and I was tired of the empty chair in the evenings with no one to share them with. I wasn't naive. I knew remarriage at that age came with complications. What I didn't know was what kind of complications were coming. The first year was good, genuinely good. Faye moved into the house I'd shared with Carol, which I'd worried about, but Faye handled it with a kind of pragmatic grace. She said she didn't want to erase anyone. She said a house that had been loved was a good house to come home to. We repainted some rooms together. We kept the garden Carol had planted out back. It felt like the right balance. What started shifting, I can say now with the clarity that only comes after everything is already burned down, was somewhere around the 14-month mark. I started having chest tightness. Nothing dramatic, just an occasional pressure that came and went, usually in the evenings. I put it down to caffeine, to getting older, to the mild anxiety I'd always carried. I also started sleeping poorly. Not insomnia exactly, but a restless, unsatisfying sleep that left me foggy the next morning. I'd wake at 4 or 5, heart thumping for no reason, and lie there in the dark listening to Faye breathe beside me. She noticed. She was attentive about it in the way she was attentive about most things, bringing me decaf tea in the evenings, suggesting I cut back on salt, coming with me to my regular checkup with my doctor. My primary care physician ran an EKG, checked my blood pressure, did routine blood work. Everything came back essentially normal for a man my age. A little elevated cortisol, possibly stress-related. She suggested I try meditation, maybe reduce my workload. I had been doing some part-time consulting work for the county school board, so I scaled back. The symptoms didn't improve much. They migrated and changed. The chest tightness became occasional palpitations. The foggy mornings stretched into foggy afternoons. I started losing words mid-sentence, the particular kind of forgetting that makes you stand in a doorway wondering why you walked into a room. I mentioned this to Faye one evening, somewhat casually, and she set down her book and looked at me with what I understood at the time as genuine concern. "Thomas," she said, "do you think we should have a more thorough cardiac workup done? Heart issues can present this way in men over 60. Your father had the bypass at 68. I know that's been on your mind." She was right that I'd thought about it. My father had been otherwise healthy when his first major cardiac event hit. I agreed. Faye actually made the appointment, called Dr. Phelps's office, and got me on the schedule within 2 weeks. She came with me to the initial consultation, sat beside me and took notes, asked the follow-up questions I forgot to ask. I remember being grateful. I remember thinking I was lucky to have someone so organized, so attentive, so present. The thorough cardiac workup was scheduled for a Thursday in February. It included a stress test, an echocardiogram, and blood work for several cardiac markers. Faye had a sensitivity appointment of her own. She'd been having what she described as persistent fatigue and had asked Dr. Turnhouse, Phelps's partner, to evaluate her while I was doing the stress test. Convenient, she'd said, to get it all done in one morning. I'd finished my stress test first and was waiting in the main reception area, still mildly winded and smelling of the electrode gel they used, when a nurse asked if I could come speak with Dr. Phelps privately. Faye was still in her appointment. Dr. Phelps was a compact, serious woman in her mid-50s. She closed the door of her office and sat across from me with that particular stillness that doctors develop when they're about to tell you something they've carefully chosen their words for. "Mr. Birch," she said, "I'd like to ask you some questions about your wife's health history before we go further. Is she under any regular care for a chronic condition that you're aware of?" I told her no, nothing chronic. The fatigue she'd come in for was new. Dr. Phelps nodded slowly. "Are you aware of any significant injuries she's sustained in the past few years? Bone fractures, trauma to the chest or ribs?" I thought about it. She'd had a bad fall while hiking in the Smokies the previous spring. Said she'd slipped on a wet route and gone down hard on her left side. Bruised ribs, she'd told me. She'd gone to urgent care while I was at a school board meeting. Come home with an ice pack and a prescription for ibuprofen. I hadn't thought much of it. We're not young. I told Dr. Phelps about the fall. She asked if there had been other injuries. There was a car accident the previous fall. Minor fender bender, Faye had called it. Said a teenager ran a yellow light and clipped her on the passenger side. She'd walked away fine, a little shaken, slight soreness in her shoulder. I'd seen the car afterward. There was noticeable damage to the passenger door, but she'd said it looked worse than it was. And before that, she'd had a bad migraine episode that had sent her to the ER alone one evening when I was in Knoxville, visiting Andrew's family. She'd called me from the hospital, calm, said it was just a severe migraine. They'd given her something for the pain, and she'd be fine. She was home by the time I offered to leave early. Dr. Phelps was quiet for a moment after I listed these. Then she said, "Mr. Birch, I need to be straightforward with you. While conducting the echocardiogram on your wife, we captured imaging that shows evidence of healed rib fractures in multiple locations, at least 3 distinct sites at different stages of healing. That means different incidents, not one fall." I heard myself say something that wasn't really a sentence. She continued carefully. "The pattern is inconsistent with what she described to us. A single hiking fall wouldn't account for what I'm seeing. I'm required by law to report what appears to be a pattern of physical trauma, and before I do that, I wanted to speak with you directly." She asked me the question that I think I already knew was coming even before she said it. Had I ever harmed my wife? I told her no. I told her never. My hands were flat on my knees, and I remember pressing them down against my legs to keep them steady. She said she believed me. The reason she believed me, she said gently, was that the pattern she was seeing, the distribution of the fractures, the variation in healing stages, the locations, was more consistent with what forensic medicine calls controlled, self-inflicted trauma than with abuse. She was careful to say she wasn't certain. She said this warranted an investigation. I asked to see Faye. Dr. Phelps asked me to wait a few more minutes. Those few minutes in that office were some of the strangest of my life. I sat there trying to fit what I'd just been told onto the woman I'd been married to for 6 years. The woman who made coffee every morning before I was awake. The woman who had cried quietly at our wedding and said I was the thing she'd stopped expecting to find. The woman who scheduled my cardiac appointments and took notes in the margins of her little notebook. When I finally walked into the room where Faye was sitting with a clinic administrator, her face rearranged itself very quickly, from something unreadable to something that looked like relief. Thomas, what is going on? They've been asking me the most intrusive questions. I sat down. I asked her to tell me about the ribs. She said it was exactly what she'd told them, the hiking fall. One incident. I said that Dr. Phelps was seeing evidence of more than one. Faye's expression flickered. The administrator said, Mrs. Birch, we have documentation we need to review with you regarding the imaging findings. What followed was a conversation I can only describe as watching someone construct a building while simultaneously taking it apart. Faye offered explanations. A childhood injury she'd forgotten to mention. An old car accident from before we met. She questioned Dr. Jorer, Phelps's interpretation of the imaging. She grew quietly indignant, the way she sometimes did when she felt she was being condescended to. She took my hand and said, Thomas, you know me. You know me. I did, or I thought I did, but I was already calculating the dates in my head. The hiking fall, the car accident, the ER migraine visit, and now 3 separate sets of healed fractures. I knew how to count. We left together. In the car she was controlled and quiet, which with Faye was often more alarming than anger. She said Dr. Phelps was being reckless. She said she intended to request a second opinion on the imaging. She looked out the window at the February sky and said, I hope you're not going to let some overzealous doctor put ideas in your head about our marriage. I said, I'm not. I was lying. The ideas were already there. That night, after Faye went to bed early claiming a headache, I went to the small room I used as a home office, and I did something I had never done before. I opened the shared filing cabinet where we kept household documents, and I went further back than I'd ever gone. Faye had taken over most of our financial administration about 2 years into the marriage. She was better at it than me, she'd said, more organized, more detail-oriented. I'd been relieved, honestly. Carol had handled most of that too, and after she died, it had felt overwhelming. I'd handed things over gradually and without much thought. What I found in the back of the filing cabinet, behind her tax returns and the homeowner's insurance binder, made me sit down on the floor. There were medical bills I had never seen. 4 ER visits in 3 years, each one on a day when I'd either been traveling or occupied. A dislocated shoulder, a fractured wrist, a rib contusion, a head laceration requiring stitches. Not one of them had she mentioned to me. Not one of them had she mentioned to me. Not one. Behind those, I found paperwork for an insurance policy I had never known existed. A personal accident and disability policy in Faye's name only, opened about 8 months after we married. The premium payments had been coming out of an account I hadn't known she had. The claims on file totaled just under $180,000 over 4 years, each claim attached to a different injury. Each one paid out. I photographed everything with my phone. I put it all back exactly as I'd found it. I sat in the dark office for a long time. Andrew called the next morning, a routine Sunday check-in. When I heard his voice, I almost lost it entirely. I asked him if he could talk for a while. He said, "Dad, what's wrong?" It wasn't a question. I told him everything. The cardiac appointment, what Dr. Phelps had found, what I'd found in the filing cabinet afterward. He was quiet for so long that I said his name. He said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Have your symptoms improved at all since you retired? Since you've been home more?" I thought about it. Actually, no. If anything, they'd gotten slightly worse over the past year. More fog, more fatigue, more of that unsettling chest flutter that didn't match any cardiac pattern Dr. Phelps could clearly identify. He said, "What does she give you in the mornings? Do you take supplements?" Faye had started making me what she called a morning tonic about 2 years ago. A glass of water, mixed with magnesium powder and some kind of herbal supplement she ordered online. Said it was something she'd read about for men over 60 with sleep issues. Said her brother-in-law swore by it. I drunk it every morning without question. It tasted slightly mineral and strange, but I'd gotten used to it. Andrew said, "Dad, stop taking it. Don't tell her you stopped. And see a different doctor. Not Dr. Phelps. Someone completely new, someone she doesn't know you're seeing." I asked him what he was suggesting. He said he wasn't sure yet. He said he just wanted me to be safe. The next morning, I poured the tonic down the bathroom sink while the shower ran to cover the sound. I told Faye my stomach was unsettled and I'd skip it for a few days. She watched me with something I couldn't name and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Take care of yourself." By the fourth day without the tonic, something was different. Not dramatically, not like a fog lifting all at once. But there were moments of clarity that felt unfamiliar. The chest flutters were quieter. I slept through the night twice in a row, which I hadn't done in over a year. I noticed it the way you notice a noise stopping that you'd stopped consciously hearing. I drove 40 minutes north to a clinic in Weaverville, where I was certain Faye had no connections. I told a physician, a young doctor named Dr. Marcus Webb, that I needed a full toxicology workup. I told him my symptoms. I told him I had a specific concern. I told him I'd been taking a supplement that I now had questions about. He didn't ask me to explain further. He ran a comprehensive tox screen and ordered additional heavy metal panels, the kind that aren't part of standard blood work. He said he'd have results within a week and that if anything significant came back, we'd need to involve other people. I drove home and sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. Living in that house those next few days was an education in how well you can perform normal when normal has become the most dangerous thing around you. I ate dinner with Faye. I watched television beside her. I let her refill my water glass and thanked her for it. I did not drink the morning tonic. I did not eat anything she prepared that I hadn't also seen prepared. I found small reasons to skip meals or eat late alone. Andrew drove down from Knoxville on the third day. He told Faye he had a work thing nearby and wanted to stop in. She seemed pleased to see him. She made chicken and rice for dinner. I watched her move around the kitchen, efficient and warm and familiar, and I thought about the filing cabinet and the $180,000 and tried to reconcile it with the woman who refilled my water glass and asked if I wanted more bread. That night, while Faye slept, Andrew and I sat on the back porch in the cold and talked in low voices. He said he'd done some searching. He'd found that Faye had filed for bankruptcy 7 years before we met, under a slightly different version of her name. Faye E. Alderton, instead of Faye M. Moore, Alderton. He'd found a civil judgment from Franklin County, Ohio, related to an insurance dispute. He'd found that the Columbus address she'd given as her residence before moving to Asheville had, according to county property records, actually been rented under a different woman's name entirely. "I don't think Alderton is even her real name," he said quietly. I looked at the dark garden where Carol's rose bushes had come back every spring for 20 years, and I tried to feel something identifiable. All I could find was a hollow exhaustion. Dr. Webb called on a Friday. He asked me to come in person. He sat across from me and said, "Mr. Birch, your blood work shows elevated levels of barium. Not acutely toxic, but consistent with chronic low-level ingestion over a significant period. In your case, probably a year or more. Barium in repeated low doses can cause cardiac irregularities, muscle weakness, gastrointestinal symptoms, cognitive fog, and disrupted sleep. It's not commonly tested for in standard panels, which is why it's been missed." He said he had already contacted the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. I sat in his office for a long time after he finished talking. There was a framed poster on his wall about the cardiovascular system. All those arteries branching, and I stared at it and thought about the mornings Faye had handed me that glass with a small, caring smile, every morning for 2 years. The detective who came to my house that afternoon was a woman named Detective Linda Foss. She was thorough and quiet and kind in the way people are kind when they're delivering information they know will be devastating. She brought a second detective with her. They bagged the supplement containers from the kitchen. They took the blender Faye used for the tonic. They took the laptop from the office. They asked Faye to come to the station for a voluntary interview. Faye looked at me before she left with them. She looked at me for a long moment, And in her face I saw her running through her options, and then I saw her settle on something. A kind of resigned composure. The expression of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and knows how to hold herself in them. She went quietly. Andrew drove me to a hotel downtown. He sat with me while I ate something I can't remember, and watched television I didn't see. At around midnight, his phone lit up with a text from Detective Foss. She'd confirmed with colleagues in Ohio that Faye's real name was Patricia Ann Cornwell. She had 2 prior marriages. The first husband had died in what was ruled an accidental fall in their home in Dayton. He'd had a documented history of cardiac irregularities for several months before the fall. The second husband had survived, but had filed a protective order against her and then, inexplicably, dropped it 4 months later. He was currently unreachable. She had been operating under the name Faye Alderton since moving to North Carolina. She had obtained the identity through a combination of legally changed middle name and documentation built around a deceased woman from Columbus with similar biographical details. The insurance fraud investigation revealed claims in 3 states across 8 years, all under different names, all following the same pattern. Injuries to herself, staged or self-inflicted, claims filed, settlements collected, and the life insurance policy. There was one on me that I had not signed. Forged. $2.3 million, with her as sole beneficiary. Taken out 14 months into our marriage. The trial was 10 months later. Andrew sat beside me for every day of it. He'd taken extended leave from work. He wouldn't hear any argument from me about it. Patricia Ann Cornwell. I had to learn to call her that, to detach the name from the face I'd looked at across the dinner table for 6 years. Sat at the defense table with a stillness that I now recognized as the practiced calm of someone who had been in courtrooms before. Her attorney argued diminished capacity, argued a history of financial desperation following her first marriage, argued that the barium levels in my system were within ranges that could have other explanations. The jury didn't find those arguments convincing. They deliberated for less than 2 days. Guilty on attempted murder, guilty on fraud by deception, guilty on identity fraud, guilty on 3 counts of insurance fraud. The judge sentenced her to 22 years. She was let out without looking back. I sat in the courthouse hallway afterward, and Andrew sat beside me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Eventually, he put his hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of it, the simple, uncomplicated fact of someone who was exactly who they'd always said they were. I sold the house in Asheville 8 months after the trial. The garden was the hardest part. Carol's rose bushes came back one last spring, and I stood among them for a while before the moving truck came. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to be leaving the place where 2 women had lived with me. One who loved me the way a person loves when they have nothing to hide, and one who had mapped out my death in the same kitchen where she told me good morning every day. Andrew and his wife found me a small house near them in Knoxville. A starter home, they kept calling it, laughing, which made me laugh too, because what exactly was I starting at 64? But they were right in the way that they meant it. It was a beginning of some kind. I joined a support group for older adults who'd experienced financial exploitation and relationship fraud. There are more of us than you'd think. We meet on Tuesday evenings at a church fellowship hall, and we drink bad coffee, and we tell the parts of our stories we can bear to tell, and we listen to the parts other people can bear to say out loud. There's a woman in the group who lost her retirement savings to a man she'd met on a church singles website. There's a man who discovered his live-in girlfriend of 4 years had been filing tax returns in his name. There's a couple whose contractor had been running a scam across 3 counties. None of us were stupid. That's the thing I most want people to understand, the thing I say when I'm asked to share. None of us were foolish or careless or unaware. We were people in transition, widowed, retired, lonely, starting over. And the people who targeted us were skilled and patient, and very, very good at looking like the thing we were hoping to find. The warning signs I missed were things I now recognize almost like a checklist. The way Faye had positioned herself gradually as my primary source of support, the way my world had shrunk slightly without my noticing. Fewer dinners with old colleagues, less time with Andrew, more evenings at home, just the 2 of us. The way she'd taken over the financial administration so naturally, I'd been relieved rather than curious. The way she responded to my doubts by invoking my love for her. "Do you trust me?" she'd asked me once. After some minor disagreement I can't even remember now. I'd said yes, and then I'd felt guilty for having had the doubt at all. That guilt is a tool. I understand that now. I still have some symptoms that Dr. Webb says may be permanent. a slight tremor in my left hand on cold mornings, occasional word retrieval gaps that last a few seconds longer than they used to. He says the barium exposure over that period of time did some damage that the body doesn't fully reverse. I've made my peace with that. Most days. What I don't have anymore is the hollow quiet of the evenings after Carol died. Andrew calls every day now, sometimes twice. His kids FaceTime me to show me things they've built or drawn or found in the backyard. On Sunday mornings, I drive to a diner 3 blocks from my house and order the same breakfast and read the paper and talk to the owner, a man named Gil who has been running that counter for 30 years and who tells the same 4 jokes in a different order every week. It's a small life in some ways, but it's completely, verifiably mine. I'm not sure I'll trust another person the way I trusted Faye, the way I handed things over, the way I let my world reorganize around her without watching carefully enough. Maybe that particular openness is gone for good. I'm still deciding whether that's a loss or just a different kind of knowing. What I do know, what I carry with me into every Tuesday night in that fellowship hall and every Sunday morning at Gil's counter, is that the people who love you are the ones who ask questions and stay worried even when you tell them everything is fine. Andrew said just be careful, and I smiled and changed the subject, and it nearly cost me everything. Listen to the people who stay worried. They're not being overprotective. They're paying attention in the way that people pay attention when they love you and can't afford to lose you. I'm still here because my son paid attention. That's the whole story in the end. Everything else is just a long way around to that. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the phone call from Dr. Webb. Not the detectives at my door. Not even the morning I poured that glass down the sink. The moment I keep returning to is earlier than all of that. It's Andrew, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, saying, just be careful, okay? And me smiling and nodding and not really hearing him. I was a history teacher for 31 years. I spent 3 decades explaining to teenagers how empires collapse. Not all at once, but slowly, through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. I knew this. I taught it. And then I lived it anyway. That's the thing nobody tells you about being deceived by someone you love. It doesn't feel like being deceived. It feels like being cared for. Every glass Faye handed me, every appointment she scheduled, every evening she sat beside me while I felt vague and foggy and slightly less like myself. It all looked exactly like love. That's what made it work. That's what made it dangerous. What I understand now on the far side of everything is that what saved me wasn't luck and it wasn't instinct. It was Andrew refusing to let his worries stay quiet. He paid attention when I'd stopped paying attention to myself. He asked the question, what does she give you in the mornings? That I should have thought to ask months earlier. That took something from him. It took the courage to say something uncomfortable to his father, who'd already lost one person he loved and was clearly fragile in ways I wasn't admitting. That kind of honesty, the kind that risks the relationship to protect the person. That's not a small thing. I don't take it for granted. And I think about what it required of me when Andrew spoke up. It required me to actually use my head rather than my hope. Because hope, when it's pointed in the wrong direction, is just another way of not looking. I had all the information I needed earlier than I realized. The hidden ER bills, the insurance policy I'd never signed, the supplement that tasted wrong from the start. My mind cataloged all of it and then filed it away under explanations I preferred. That was a failure of reasoning, not stupidity. I want to be clear about that, because I've met enough people in that Tuesday night fellowship hall to know that none of us were foolish. We were people in transition who wanted something to be true, and we let that wanting do the work that our judgment should have been doing. Recovery, I've learned, isn't one event. It's accumulative, the same way the damage was. Some mornings the tremor in my left hand is barely there. Some mornings it reminds me clearly of what 2 years of barium does to a nervous system. I've stopped wishing those mornings away. They keep me honest about the cost of what happened, and that honesty is something I need. What I try to carry forward, and what I try to pass along in that church fellowship hall on Tuesday nights, is that getting through something like this requires all 3 of the things I probably should have been teaching more explicitly in 31 years of history class. It requires the moral clarity to name what's wrong even when naming it is painful. It requires the intellectual honesty to look at evidence instead of preference. And it requires the kind of stubborn, grinding endurance that doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It just feels like getting up again, and then once more after that. I'm still here. Andrew calls every day. Gil at the diner tells the same 4 jokes in a different order every Sunday morning. The rose bushes didn't come with me to Knoxville, but the garden gets a little more like mine each season. That's enough. Most days, that's exactly enough.